Had I grown up in a different place in the world, had I grown up in a different religion, in a different faith, my experiences and my journey would have been very, very different.
This podcast was sponsored by King James and the 12 Disciples. Just kidding.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate having you on the podcast yet again, but a new podcast this time. Thanks for dedicating your time to us. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about our subject matter today. It's something that I'm passionate about and really enjoy having conversations about faith and perspective and how my faith has evolved and changed over the years.
Excellent. And I can't wait to hear it because I'm so curious. I feel like every time I hear a story from you, it's something more interesting that I want to know more about. So this is perfect. If you want, I would like to start with just kind of an introduction in terms of who you are, and then leading into your experience with religion and theology and growing up in the faith, and kind of go from there.
Sure. So my name is Scot Loyd, and currently I'm a professor of communication studies and debate coach at a small private Christian university in the Midwest. And I've been teaching communication for over a couple of decades now, and coaching debate as well. And that's how you and I have a connection, is through our debate experiences. I grew up in a small rural Pentecostal church, and that Pentecostal church and that Pentecostal experience gave me a lot of good gifts as well as some baggage. And so I'm still in the process now, some 5 decades into my life, trying to unpack that and figure all of that out. But I would still consider myself a person of faith. I still believe that Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world. And my personal faith and perspective is that I find joy and fulfillment and human flourishing in that faith. Now, does that mean that everything is perfect and I've got everything figured out? Certainly not. And I would never condemn someone who makes a different choice than what I have made. But growing up in that Pentecostal church, I received a love for Scripture and the Bible, and memorized a lot of it and committed a lot of it to memory. But I was taught to take the Bible literally in every place. Since then, my view of Scripture has changed. I now see the Bible less as a instruction manual and more as a book of wisdom that gives me perspective for my daily walk. And I believe that it contains wisdom. So the way that I like to say it, it's a very common saying. Instead of taking the Bible literally now, I no longer take it literally, but I still take it seriously.
That's a really good way to put it. I no longer take it literally, I take it seriously. I was talking to my brother the other day, and we were talking about how in our mind, the Bible is more of like Aesop's fables. Like it's a bunch of stories that were meant to teach a lesson, as opposed to this is literally what happened, right? Like she turned into a pillar of salt when she turned around and looked at the city that he told her, and so I'm so glad that you phrased it the way that you did during your introduction when you said that it comes with baggage that's both negative and positive, because that's literally the purpose of this podcast, is trying to analyze what positive and negative traits and memories and things that people learned that they're still taking with them, having grown up in the faith and grown up in religion. So that's literally exactly what I was hoping to get from you. It's like you read my mind. What was, if you can remember, what was the first time that you really felt a connection in a church or to a faith? Do you remember how old you were when it really like hit you the first time?
Right. So I remember some of my earliest memories, even before attending school, So probably as a toddler, you know how you have memories of, they're not necessarily concrete, but they're sort of images in your mind and feelings associated with that. So some of my earliest memories as a very young child was kneeling beside my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who kept me during the day because both of my parents worked, and kneeling beside of her and hearing her pray. And because we were Pentecostal, I also remember hearing her speak in other tongues, which is sort of it's not a language. It's more of a sort of a spiritual trance where people receive a lot of emotional fulfillment and sort of a euphoric feeling because of the practice. And I remember endeavoring to mimic her. So she would say words and I would try to repeat what she was saying as a little child. And I also remember that I have a lot of images with her having her big King James Bible opened on the table and her reading that. And I remember before I could read or write, taking that Bible and tracing the words and endeavoring to learn how to write and repeat those words going through that. So those are some of my earliest memories. And then beyond that, I remember sitting on a church pew with my mom sitting in her lap. I have images of taking her hands and clapping them to the hymns that we were singing and going through that. And that was some powerful images that sort of branded me early on. So in the church that I grew up in, there was a lot of worship. There was a lot of sensory perception. So there were a lot of sounds and there were a lot of emotions associated with worship. So a lot of people grow up in Christian traditions where it's very quiet, where the worship is very structured, where there is liturgical readings, things of that nature. That wasn't my experience at all. It was a free for all. It was a rock concert, spontaneous type of experience with a very small crowd, very loud singing, outburst of emotions, crying, weeping, laughing, dancing, leaping, jumping up and down, and even what we called running the aisle. So people would take off running down the middle aisle. They would run around the church, often with their eyes closed, which meant that sometimes there were accidents. I remember some of my earliest memories were watching people run around the church and they would hit the wall and then they would like back up and then turn the corner. And then later on, I remember being at a Pentecostal conference and sitting in the balcony and watching people do this, run around the arena floor. And there was a group of ladies standing in a corner worshiping, and a guy was making his rounds. And when he turned the corner, he slipped and he slid into the back of those women and he knocked them all down like bowling pins. And me and my friend were standing in the balcony and we started giving each other high fives, and it was great. So those were my experiences early on, very loud, lots of sensory perception and all of that. So that was just amazing experiences that sort of, branded themselves into my mind as a young man.
And now, do you still consider yourself Pentecostal, or have you segued into a different branch or sect, I suppose?
Sure. So what I've retained from my Pentecostal heritage is that I do believe that God created us as emotional beings. So you have two strands of thought, and really it's a spectrum, but just for sake of simplicity, there are people who are very intellectual about their faith and sort of divorce it from their emotions. And they say, well, emotions are a dangerous thing. You should never be emotional. But I don't believe God created us that way. I believe that it's a head and a heart. So to divorce the head from the heart is a very dangerous thing to do. And likewise, if it's all based in emotion, then that can be very dangerous as well. So what I've retained from my Pentecostal heritage is this idea that my emotions are important. What I feel is important. What I perceive with my emotions are important, but it's also important to think critically about my faith and to seriously evaluate and to scrutinize the claims that are made about truth. So growing up in my Pentecostal heritage, there wasn't a lot of scrutiny going on. There wasn't a lot of reinforcement of critical thinking skills. In fact, we were told often to not think about it too critically, just to go with the feeling.
The faith aspect, where it's
absolutely.
Just to blindly believe.
Absolutely. So where I'm at now, I'm sort of a hybrid. I believe that I'm endeavoring. I haven't achieved it perfectly, but I'm endeavoring to marry the head to the heart and to balance them both, and to see that both aspects of that are important. So right now, my wife and I attend a small Baptist, Southern Baptist congregation, but there are lots of things that trouble me about Southern Baptists. But that's just where we're at right now and where we've landed. So obviously in Southern Baptist traditions, they would frown upon outbursts of emotion or even expressing emotions of any kind in a prolonged way. Even if you're expressing that about God, they would say, well, you've got to be very careful about those things. So what I have retained from my Pentecostal heritage is that I think emotions are important, that they are valuable, and when put in the right context, they can be very helpful to understanding what it means to be human.
Absolutely. Do you, other than the inability or the rule against showing emotion, do you remember any other aspects of religion that made you pause or kind of question? Do you remember anything like that? Or what was like the first lesson or rule that you heard where you were like, I don't necessarily jive with this, so I'm not going to consider myself this religion anymore?
Sure. So my small Pentecostal sect that I grew up in had prohibitions that were mostly aimed at women. And of course, that was a big red flag as I started critically evaluating where I was at. There were dress codes that were employed. For instance, women were told that they could not wear anything but skirts and dresses. So pants of any kind, including shorts, were prohibited for women. Women were told that they could not cut their hair at all. They had to let it grow long. Depending on where you were at, there were prohibitions against jewelry. Certainly there were no earrings or necklaces or anything of that kind. And even depending on where you were at in the country, wedding rings were sometimes prohibited.
I'm surprised by that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were prohibitions against going to the movies, having a television. All forms of what was considered worldly entertainment was prohibited. There was a prohibition, and this is a little funny, against what was known. I mean, it was literally printed in the handbook, no mixed bathing, which was their archaic term for swimming.
Oh, okay. I was going to say that clicked like 10 seconds later.
Yeah. So you could not go swimming. If you did go swimming, it only had to be with people of your gender, and the preference was that you remain fully clothed. So there are literally pictures of Pentecostal women swimming in blue jean skirts and blouses, and it was just odd.
That is odd.
Some of the justifications were that you've got to keep those particular fences up because one thing can lead to another. And so, immediately if you start swimming with boys with girls, girls with boys, the next stop on that train is sex, of course. And that was the thinking. So obviously there was no dancing, there was no alcohol consumption, there was no smoking of any kind.
That's so interesting to me that that's the branch that encouraged you to emote and to show and to feel, but don't dance. Don't show, don't feel in that way. That seems so counterproductive.
Yeah, and it was amazing because the only place that we could express feelings of euphoria and emotion was at a Pentecostal altar service. And in retrospect, if you look back at the behavior of people in those particular situations and circumstances, it was a reflection of what a lot of people would have experienced in the normative ways that they grew up. You know, you would go to a rock concert or you would go to a football game and you would yell and scream and you would feel good when your team scored a touchdown. But there was that outlet was prohibited for us. And so the only way that you could express those feelings were in response to what was known as the Spirit of God or the infilling of the Holy Spirit. And of course, you think about that prolonged over years and years and years of that being reinforced, that can jack you up in ways.
That's like the best way to put it. That'll jack you
where
up.
wires get crossed, right?
Yeah.
So, it was almost you developed, for lack of a better term, it was almost like a fetish was developed for particular experiences. And then, what gets rewarded, what gets repeated. And so because you associate those euphoric feelings with those actions, they get repeated over and over and over again.
Wow, that's so interesting. Now, does that lack of emoting and lack of being able to show kind of your feelings, did that carry over into the household as well? Did you find that families were not very emotional, or they didn't talk about feelings, or how did that work? Did that carry over, do you think?
Well, I can only speak to my experience, but I do know that in our home, there was not a lot of expression of feelings or emotion. And when there was, it was when those feelings sort of bottled up and then they were unleashed in unhealthy ways. And then speaking to others that had similar experiences, a lot of times there was a dichotomy between what happened at church and what happened at home. So, everyone has that sort of dysfunctional, duplicity in their lives where there is a difference between what they say they believe and how they behave in front of others, and then how they behave privately.
Right.
But we had growing up, we had no way to process that. No one in my family talked about it, and certainly no one in the church talked about it. Everything was put in spiritual terms. So everything was put in biblical terms. And there was a lot of surface and shallow conversation, but not a lot of depth when it came to questioning your faith, exploring complicated and often contradictory feelings and emotions, and just trying to figure out the world. So we lived in this bubble. And thankfully, my dad, he didn't go to church at all for a large portion of my life. So he didn't abide by many of the prohibitions. We always had a television. It was always on. So I had the window to the real world, so to speak. And, obviously, I noticed very quickly that there was a difference in how most people lived their lives and how we lived our lives. And it was always couched in terms that, we're sacrificing because this is what God wants us to do, and we're going to be rewarded in the afterlife. But there wasn't a whole lot of connection as to why we did what we did. And as I became older and began to study the Bible for myself, and ironically, the tools that my church gave me to read, to memorize, and to study scripture were the actual tools that led me away from their brand of faith, because I began to see that lots of what we're talking about isn't in the Bible.
Right.
And,
Yes.
and
Yes.
it isn't supported by Scripture.
Right.
And
Yes.
if the Bible is the final arbiter of truth, then why are we living this way? Why are we conducting our lives this way when it has no support in the Bible?
Right. I have always said, and I swear you can hear it in other episodes, I've always said that the people I know who question the most are the people who have actually read the Bible. And the people who are the most like entirely devout that I know, who live like verbatim as though it is exactly how you should live, are the people who haven't actually read the entire Bible. So I think that's very interesting that you read it and you're like, wait a second, none of this is in here. Like none of this is in the handbook. I don't understand.
And that was an epiphany for me. And it was a long process, because if you're conditioned to believe and to interpret and to understand life from a particular perspective, when you start moving away from that, it's very difficult to do. There's a lot of dissonance that takes place inwardly in your mind and in your heart. And then obviously all of the connections, the relational connections, are having to be navigated. You feel a connection and a loyalty to family and to your church friends and to your lifestyle. And for me, it was a very slow process that probably took over about a decade to complete, whereas I feel very comfortable talking with you about this today, probably 5 to 7 years ago, I would have avoided conversations like this because, first of all, I wasn't sure how I felt in a lot of areas. And I would want to avoid hurting the feelings of loved ones who might see this or hear this.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's a huge part of religion and and specific chapters of certain religions, is the way that the majority of people kind of end up staying there as opposed to exploring all of their options, is because of that fear of like hurting families' feelings, or insinuating that by exploring things or researching things, they think you're insinuating that there's something wrong with the way they live, or that they're, unintelligent or something. And I feel like that's a huge misconception, when I think, if anything, I think churches should encourage people to do research and to discover why it is they believe what they believe, why it is they feel a certain way.
Absolutely. And when it comes to my family and loved ones and friends that I still count as friends that have chosen to remain in the church that I grew up in, I always want to communicate to them that my intention in sharing my story is not to diminish your faith. It's not to diminish your experience. I have no desire or no intention of endeavoring to proselyte you or to convert you to my way of thinking. Right. This is my experience. This is my story. These are my feelings. And I feel compelled to share my story and experience with others, because as I continue to grow, there are a lot of people who share my feelings, right, and share my experiences. And one of the things that all of us look for in our lives is validation and community. And in order to be a human being that's flourishing and experiencing life, we all need that. So just in the same way that family and friends have chosen to remain in the church because it serves as a validation to their feelings and their experience and serves as a community for them, I'm still in the process of finding my own. And by telling my story, it helps me find others that share my experiences and feelings, and helps that community grow.
Absolutely. And I think within religion, I feel like there's the misconception that if you have questions, or if you have doubts, or if you're confused, that means that you are atheist or you're agnostic or something like that. When in reality, I think it's very much like anything else. You just need to know why it is that you believe something, or if you believe something. Kind of like in your instance, you thought, I don't agree with a lot of these rules. This doesn't seem right. It's not even in the Bible. I'm going to figure out where I need to go that aligns more with what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling. And kind of in that same regard, what is it that, because I know you're a very highly educated individual, you do research, especially through debate, like constantly. What is it about Christianity, as opposed to any other religion that's ever existed, that makes you feel the most comfortable believing in that, as opposed to the ancient Roman gods, or Hinduism or Taoism or Judaism or anything like that? What makes you so comfortable in Christianity that you're willing to kind of wear that badge?
Sure. So as I think about it objectively, try to think about it as objectively as I can, and with the caveat that all of us cannot rid ourselves of the biases and the subjectivity that we have. I think that's part of it. My comfort level that I have with Christianity, in all transparency, is probably because of my formative experiences growing up in a Christian sect.
Mm-hmm.
Had I grown up in a different place in the world, had I grown up in a different religion, in a different faith, my experiences and my journey would have been very, very different. So the fact that, there's an old saying that geography is destiny. The fact that I was born and raised in rural Northeast Arkansas, and happened to be born into a family that was of the Pentecostal tradition, had a lot to do with forming my beliefs early on. But as I've grown and as I have explored other options, and certainly within the Christian faith, looked at a multiplicity of denominations and thoughts and traditions, and then also beyond that, part of formal education is exploring world religions and looking into those faith traditions. And what I can say now, that probably I would have been uncomfortable saying before, is that when you look at every religious tradition from around the world, I think it is wise to point out that every tradition has its points of wisdom and its points where there are helpful ways of looking at the world and looking at one another and attempting to understand the concept of God. And even among atheists and agnostics, they have helpful things to say and helpful words to contribute to the conversation. You just did a series on your podcast where you were rebroadcasting some of the most thoughtful atheists that have ever lived and have dealt with these difficult questions. And I found many of the things that they had to say inspiring and helpful and thought-provoking. So everyone lives by a philosophy. Even if you say, I have no philosophy, even if you say that I believe in no God, that is a philosophy. That is a belief system that is at some level governing your actions and your choices and your thoughts.
Yeah.
So the reason that I've come to settle on Christianity is because, quite frankly, of Jesus. I look at the life, the death, and I believe that there is substantial evidence for a supernatural resurrection. Now, can I say with certainty that Jesus died and 3 days later he rose again? I can't say that with 100% certainty because obviously I wasn't there. But I believe that there is substantial and credible evidence that something profound happened around this man named Jesus. For example, we have the Christian faith with us to this day. There have been lots and lots of opportunities for it to be disproved, for it to be diminished. And even though I think its influence and the influence of all religion in the world is diminishing, that's not to say that at some point in history, in the future, it may experience a resurgence. So looking back in the totality of history, there have been moments where Christianity has experienced moments of great influence. And there have been moments where its influence has been diminished. And I think the pendulum has swung to a point where we're seeing it diminished right now.
Mm-hmm.
But who's to say that in the future it won't make a resurgence? But my point is that looking back, I believe that there were enough opportunities for the primal followers of Jesus, had they been perpetuating a lie and had they been perpetuating a hoax, specifically around the resurrection of Jesus, that there were enough opportunities for it to be exposed, that there were enough opportunities for it to be debunked early on. To this point in history, we don't have evidence of enough evidence either way, I think, to say this did not happen. I happen to believe that because there was such a profound change in the early followers of Jesus, for instance, up until the point that Jesus was purported to rise again, all of those original followers worshiped in the Jewish faith, and their day of worship was Saturday. Their entire culture was built around that. And then suddenly it changed from Saturday to Sunday. Those primal original followers were in a position to know whether or not Jesus had indeed rose again from the dead, but they were perpetuating a hoax. And if they were indeed perpetuating a hoax, all of them were willing to die horrid deaths for something they were in a position to know was a lie.
Right.
And none of them recanted, or at least we don't have any reports of them recanting.
Right.
So to me, what that communicates at the very least is they believed in what they were preaching. They believed in what they were saying. They believed that Jesus literally rose from the dead. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that he literally did and that there was evidence of it. But what I'm saying is that they believed it so wholeheartedly that they were willing to die for that belief. Now,
Right.
many people will die for something they believe to be true, but it stretches the bounds of credulity, at least in my mind, that people are willing to die for something they are in a position to know is a lie.
Right.
And we
Right.
don't have any evidence of that happening. So
Right.
looking back at Christianity, to me, there's sufficient evidence to suggest that something happened. And when I look at the life and the teachings of Jesus, I'm not talking about everything that surrounds him
Right.
with the religion that grew up known as Christianity. But when I
Like
look
the,
at
the red text is what
right,
you're talking
yeah.
about.
When I look at what Jesus said and how he lived his life, he was a profound person. And that has, I believe, that has implications for my life. And so that's sort of the short answer as to why I've settled on Christianity.
Absolutely. Now, in your entirely honest opinion, like straight up, be as real as you feel, do you think that people who are atheist and agnostic go to hell after they die? Or do you believe in something different? Because I know, for example, Catholicism has purgatory. I feel like each religion has its own version of kind of what happens to us after we die. And do you believe that an unsaved atheist or agnostic person would go to hell for not
Well,
being
first of
Christian?
all, yeah, when we talk about the concept of hell, there are a lot of strands of Christianity that would reject even the concept of hell. That would suggest that there is a literal, eternal lake of fire where people who do not believe in Christianity are sent to be punished for all of eternity. If you think about that from a logical perspective, it doesn't make any sense. Something that is done by a finite person in a finite time would then be punished for that particular sin for all of eternity, an infinite amount of time. Even in our justice system, as imperfect as it is, we understand that there's this concept that the punishment should fit the crime.
Right.
So this idea that God's justice would somehow be less, would be held to less of a standard than our justice doesn't make sense. So I'm not sure. When Jesus was talking about hell, I think there's a lot of evidence that he was talking in hyperbolic language, that he was using metaphors, that he was speaking in terms that his audience would have understood in that day, and even in the Jewish tradition that Jesus was a part of. there were lots of different understandings about what happens to someone after they die. To say that, if someone chooses not to believe, are they going to be punished forever and ever? I'm not comfortable with saying that. I don't believe that. I think you would be hard pressed to demonstrate that from the Bible, even from a Christian tradition that is reasonable. So to answer your question, no.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because when I spoke to atheists and agnostics from this podcast and outside of this podcast, something that I feel like everybody kind of had in common was even people who aren't religious think that the 10 commandments are pretty reasonable advice. Don't kill anybody, don't sleep with your neighbor's wife, don't be gluttonous. And also something that a lot of people seem to have in common, both religious and non-religious, is this idea that these wonderful, amazing people that they know would be sent to burn forever because they didn't accept a faith that was the correct faith. And I think that this idea, as we get older and we start to meet like really smart, really talented, really cool people that we know are not religious, this idea that they would be subjected to eternal torture because they didn't believe something that, in their opinion, they just didn't see enough evidence to suggest was true. And I know that a lot of people who consider themselves atheist and agnostic are still spiritual. I was talking to somebody the other day. He's like, I do believe that there is something. There is a supposed, God being that is there for us, that is watching over us. This person said that they just didn't believe it was verbatim the Bible. They just didn't agree with the Bible. And so I think it's very interesting that you say that, because I feel like that's a kind of a widely agreed upon stance. And then you have religions like Judaism, who I don't even think hell exists in theirs. And I don't believe that heaven exists either in certain sects of Judaism. So it's very interesting.
And I just want to clarify, that this isn't just my opinion.
Right.
You can take my opinion for what it's worth. But I would encourage everyone to do their own research.
Right.
Even what Christians have believed historically and throughout time has evolved and changed. If you look at what early Christians believed, and then what the medieval church believed, and then what people embraced at the early part of the 20th century versus now believed, that is continually changing, and there's lots of perspectives and there's lots of feelings on the afterlife and what that looks like. The Bible does have a lot to say, but again, it comes down to interpretation. It comes down to understanding. And if you insist on a literal interpretation of Scripture, and this is where I point out, if you're going to insist on a literal interpretation of Scripture, then you got to be consistent with that throughout the Bible. What ends up happening is people cherry pick what they're literally embracing, and what they're saying, well, that's symbolic, and you've got to understand it like this.
Right.
But then what you end up doing is you end up saying, my perspective and the people that share my perspective on the Bible exclusively are the only people that's got it right, and everybody else has got it wrong. That is a tremendously arrogant position.
Yes.
And I grew up in a tradition where we did that. And we said, it doesn't matter what 2,000 years of church history has said, because we received this particular revelation. And so we can't listen to anybody else. We just got to believe what we feel is right in our heart, which is okay. But then you're being entirely subjective, and you can't objectively apply that to the rest of humanity.
Yes. And I think they mentioned this a little bit in those episodes that I posted with Sam Harris and those gentlemen. I think it says a lot about someone who is very religious when they can admit that they don't know. I feel like the religious people that I trust the most are the people that you ask a question and they're like, that's a great question. I don't know. Kind of like I asked you a moment ago what you think about hell. And you were like, I'm not really sure. Here's kind of the idea that I'm going with, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you this is fact and that this is 100% how it is. And I think that is an idea that modern Christianity and modern religions in general really need to embrace, because I feel like they would Christianity, so much of what we believe is proselytizing and bringing people into the fold. And I think they would find that they would have a much greater success bringing people in and keeping them if they were able to say, I don't know, actually. That's a great question. I'm going to look into that, and then I'm going to get back to you with what perhaps I think, as opposed to the people that you were mentioned earlier who swear up and down that they live their life exactly by the Bible. And all you have to do is ask them, so you don't wear mixed fabrics ever? And they're like, no, that was a metaphor. Okay, but gays shouldn't get married. That's not a metaphor, because I'm pretty sure the word gay doesn't show up in the Bible ever. It's just very interesting where you're not supposed to eat pork. Well, they just said that back then because people died from, meat poisoning. It's like, okay, you're not supposed to wear mixed fabrics, so you can't wear a Bears jersey on Sunday. No, they just said that because, back then gays should be allowed to get married. No, that's a sin, or like you should be able to sleep with people before you're married. No, that's awful. It's just very interesting what people, like you said, cherry pick sometimes. And I feel like a lot of the loudest voices in Christianity are actually the outliers, and that most Christians aren't actually like that. The loudest ones that you hear are the ones that always make the news, for saying things and doing things that might be considered racist or far right, when in reality I think Christians as a whole are very similar to what you're describing, where it's like, I don't have all the answers. I don't necessarily believe that every single thing in the Bible is verbatim true. I do have questions, and I really appreciated that you said the reason that you are claiming Christianity is because of the circumstances under which you were born and raised. And I think that's a fantastic example of somebody admitting, like, I don't have all the answers. This is probably why I think this way. But at the end of the day, I sleep best believing this and living this way.
And I would just add to that, this idea of certainty. Anyone that claims ideas, especially in the philosophical realm or the religious realm, if we're talking about questions of origin, meaning, morality, destiny, the afterlife, things of that nature. Anyone who claims certainty, I'm very wary of those kinds of claims. And right. I would add, even someone who embraces an atheist or an agnostic worldview that is making those claims with a great deal of certainty. And you do see instances of that as well. Certainly no atheist that I've ever met or interacted with would make claims of certainty, but I do know that they are out there because I've read.
They're out there somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah. And so, anyone, religious or irreligious, that makes claims about things that we're not in a position to know about right now, with certainty, you have to be wary of those kinds of claims. Yeah. Absolutely look at the evidence. Absolutely evaluate different perspectives and different ideas. Look at your own life. Look at what is making a difference in your life and what isn't. And because everybody's going to live by a philosophy. I think where we get into danger is when we embrace fundamentalisms. And what I mean by that is when you attach, this is my belief, or this is my cultural perspective, or this is my way of looking at politics or global geopolitical positions or morality, and I'm going to attach God endorsing what I believe to the world. And so when I play that God card, how do you respond to that? If somebody says, well, I'm not just speaking for myself, this is what God endorses, what I'm saying.
Right.
How do you come back from that?
Yeah, that reminds me so much of when we're kids and we're playing at somebody else's house and they're like, well, my house, my rules, and then you have to play the game according to how they want. I always tell people I don't have any issue with any religion until they start trying to pass legislation or rules that tell me I can't live how I believe. And that's the only time that I ever have an issue with organized religion or religious people. And I feel like a lot of Christians and a lot of religious people also believe that way. They're like, do what you want, live how you want, but don't then try to pass rules that make me also live how you want, because that's not your business, right? And
Right. Yeah, and to be fair, all legislation, all government is a reflection of somebody's morality.
right,
But the best government, historically speaking, and I think this can be said objectively, is one that takes into consideration the greatest good for the greatest number of people and makes an effort to protect those that have divergent views or perspectives. And I think historically the United States has done a good job of that. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Are there all kinds of evils that have been perpetuated by our system? Yes. But what I'm saying is our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, the fact that the First Amendment guarantees us freedom of religion, which also infers that you can choose to not practice any religion at all. And it sets up a government and a way of life that says, you do your thing, I'll do my thing. And as long as we don't infringe on other people's ideas or behaviors, things of that nature, we can all get along and move forward.
right. I tried to explain it to somebody once who was talking about how they were basically kind of Spark Notes. What they had to say was they were okay with laws being changed as long as they followed the lines of what this person believed. They were like, well, I don't mind if church and state are combined as long as it's basically what they believed, because they thought that was like the most right way to live. And I remember telling them, I was like, I hate black licorice. I don't like it. I think it's gross. If it disappeared tomorrow, I would not be upset. At no point in my life, though, have I ever been like, I hate black licorice so much, I don't want you to have it either. I don't want you to have it. I don't want you to have it. Nobody's allowed to have black licorice. Trust me, I'm doing what's best for you by taking this opportunity away. And what I would rather have is people hear that I don't like black licorice. I don't want anybody to have black licorice. They try it, they don't like it, and then they come join me in my, congregation. They're like, oh, you're right. I wish I'd listened to you earlier. I feel like that's the best way to kind of get people to understand what you're believing, is not to take away things that you don't think they should have, but instead to allow them to experience those things and then come to you and be like, why was that so awful or confusing? Or why did I hate that so much?
Right. And just to extend your analogy, that doesn't mean that you can't advocate that you shouldn't like black licorice and present your evidence and present your opinions and your feelings. That's the wonderful thing about freedom.
Make the shirt, make the bumper sticker, make everything.
Absolutely. And to bring this back to our conversation about Christianity, if people want to enter into a conversation with me about faith, I encourage people, do your own research, look at the truth claims of Christianity, look at the life of Jesus, evaluate it. And you don't have to decide today. Anybody that puts pressure on you to decide today, well, they're not perpetuating something that is being truly authentic and transparent.
Right.
You can decide tomorrow. You can decide next year. Enjoy the journey. But what I'm saying is, don't dismiss Jesus or don't dismiss Christianity out of hand without first looking at what it claims to be, not what others have said about it, not how others project it into the world, but look at the primal Christian claims, look at the life of Jesus. And then if you choose not to, by all means, go in peace. But let me advocate for my perspective and let's talk about it.
Right. Like, you wouldn't write a negative review for a business you've never been to because somebody told you that it was a bad business, right? You wouldn't do that. So why would you have that attitude towards other people's beliefs and their faiths? Because this podcast is kind of geared towards people who are a little bit in between. They can't really decide, do they want to remain religious? Do they want to explore anti or like outside of religious ideas? Has there ever been a time in your life where you did truly question your faith, or have you always been pretty strong in the idea that you consider yourself a Christian?
I question my faith all the time, but not to the point of abandoning my faith. I don't know if that makes sense, but
that makes
there's
sense.
there's never been a moment in my life where I've gone, you know what, I'm just going to embrace atheism, or I'm going to embrace agnosticism, I believe that there is a God. I believe that Jesus Christ is the image of God to the world. This Jesus is how we understand God. It doesn't mean that everybody has to understand God the way that I do, but I'm talking exclusively for me. But everything else about my faith, I'm going to question, I'm going to investigate, I'm going to talk about it. And that pendulum may swing back and forth. There may be moments where I feel very passionate about a certain perspective of my faith. And then in a few years, that might change. Where I'm at today, and I still consider myself a Christian, and I honestly I consider myself a Christian leader, a pastor, someone that has a desire and giftings and callings to lead others and to help others better understand Christianity. And so what I say is Christianity is less about imposing prohibitions on how you live your life, especially in private. And it's more about how you live your life in the community of humanity. How do you help others? If your Christianity is just about what you experience on Sunday morning, and it's just about the prohibitions, the things that you can't do, then what good is your Christianity doing anybody else?
Right.
If it secures you a place in heaven, first of all, I would say, how is it that that a finite creature is able to earn their way into a place of eternal bliss? To me, that sets up this idea that it's a contest, and somehow we're all trying to out religious one another. That makes no sense. Yeah, exactly. So my Christianity and how I endeavor to lead others to live out their Christianity is to look at the injustices that surround us. And you don't have to be a Christian to do this. Obviously, atheists care very much about the world and their fellow human beings. And we all, to a certain extent, want the world to be a better place, not only for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren. So as a Christian, if you really believe that Jesus lived and died and rose again, what are those implications for your life and how you're treating the person that you meet next to you that believes differently than you do? How are you advocating for Black lives that matter and that have been disproportionately relegated to a marginalized status in our world? How do you respond to people who have different ideas about sexuality and orientation and gender and how they live that out? And here's the thing, just because you entertain an idea and seek to understand an idea doesn't mean that you have to embrace it. And it doesn't mean that you have to condemn it either. You can love someone, you can help someone, you can fully embrace who they express themselves to be, and it has no impact on how you live your life. You can be a loving person and love others as well, and give them the freedom and the space to be who they are, or as they see themselves at the moment. Because truth be told, we're all evolving, we're all changing. I'm not the man that I was 5 minutes ago. I'm not the man that I was 5 years ago. I'm certainly not the man that I was 25 years ago. I won't be the same man in 10 years. So give humanity space. And if your Christianity is real, if you truly believe Jesus lived and died and rose again, as I do, then that has implications not only for your life, but more importantly, for everybody's life around you. So how are you treating them? How are you loving them? How are you advocating, using your voice, your influence, your power to make the world a better place for everyone, and not just those that believe like you?
Yes. I don't know if you could hear Tori was sitting over here going, like with everything you said. Wonderful. Like I don't even have like notes on that. Like I agree with everything you just said. So kind of in closing, what would you say is a time that you felt like this is God? A thing that happened, or a thought that you had, or something in your life where you said, this to me personally is proof that there is God. This thing, this time, this event, this person.
Yeah. I think there are everyday moments that I see and I hear and I feel the presence of God. And again, it's not a literal voice that I'm hearing. If God ever does decide to speak to me in that way, I hope that I have the sense not to tell anyone. And people that make those claims, I don't know why you would ever tell anyone that God spoke to you vocally. So last weekend I had the privilege of holding my granddaughter. She's 9 months old, and feeling her flesh up against mine, and holding her in my arms and smiling, and opening a book and seeing her tiny hands turn those pages and watching her. I think I had a very sense that, wow, God is in this moment. And in the same way, when I have the opportunities to express how I feel towards those that I love. And does it mean that all my relationships are perfect? No. Like everybody else's, I have baggage. I have difficulties. I have my own set of harms that I've imposed through my own selfishness, and I have to learn and grow through all of that. But in those relationships, when they're good and even when they're not good, I think God is revealing himself to me in a way that is profound. When I read a book, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be the Bible, and something in my mind happens, a light bulb moment, it goes off, and it's like, wow, that is a profound thought. That is a profound way of looking at the world. When I hear someone read a piece of poetry that they've written, or perform a piece of music, or I hear my wife sing or my children sing, those are moments that I hear and I feel the presence of God in a very profound and very real way. And in the moments when I'm at my lowest point, and when I'm having great difficulty with the world around me and trying to figure out my place in it, in those private moments where I speak to God, I open my mouth and I say, God, this doesn't make any sense. I don't like this. Or God, I'm angry at you right now, because if it's true what I believe about you, that you are all powerful and all knowing, I don't appreciate you allowing this to happen in my life. And in those moments when I'm able to express those feelings, and a lot of times they're accompanied by tears and by groanings and by just that wretched feeling that you feel when you're really, really emotional. Those are moments where afterwards, and you can chalk it up, and maybe it is, I don't know, maybe it's just an emotional release that I've had. But in those moments, in the aftermath, when I feel a sense of peace and when I feel a sense of release, I think that's God.
Awesome. I knew this was going to be a good interview, but I feel like this was a great interview. This was perfect. I swear, anybody listening to this, I did not send him the questions ahead of time. We did not talk about this at all, but that's awesome. Scott, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your feelings and your beliefs with us. I really think you hit some points today that will give people a lot to think about, a lot to kind of mull over in their head. And I think a lot of what you said today will really help people kind of decide what, maybe not like what concrete decision they want to make, but it'll really help them feel like they have the right and the ability to kind of explore and research and decide for themselves what it is that they believe. And I think it'll make people feel very comfortable questioning things. And I think that's so important. So thank you so much for your time, for your ideas. Do you have any questions or final thoughts?
I don't think so. That was just really good.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sydney. It's my pleasure. Honestly, anytime. I enjoy our conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel a series coming. And so get ready for it. I may hit you up because I feel a series coming, if that's okay.
Good times. I'd love to. Anytime, Sydney.
And